Okay, aloha kako. My name is Hiʻilei Julia Kawehipua Kaho'opulani. I'm Kanaka Maoli from the island of Oahu in Hawaii. I will be the moderator for the second half of the day. I'm a Native Studies postdoc here at Columbia, the first ever in this institution. I'm very humbled to be here. And I'm very excited to introduce our next set of speakers. And so like what Professor Hutchinson did this morning, I will introduce them in the order that they are in the program. They'll come up and speak one at a time, and then we'll all sit down together for Q&A. So our first speaker is Crystal Migwans, who is Anishinaabe of Wiikwemikoong, Unceded First Nation, and the place she calls Unceded First Nation. A multimedia artist by training, Crystal's path turned to research and community arts during her time as a curatorial assistant at the Ojibwe Cultural Foundation in Chigag, Canada. She's currently in the art history PhD program at Columbia University in New York, where she looks for echoes of Anishinaabe artistic legacy in the archives of the colonial metropolis. And I checked all of my pronunciations with her before coming up here, and then I got so nervous that I screwed it up. So I'm sorry, Crystal. Teri Greeves is a beadworker who both follows and updates the Kiowa tradition of beadworking. Her work is represented in museum collections throughout the world, including the Brooklyn Museum here in New York. Recently, she's been included in important exhibitions of contemporary Native art at the Peabody Essex Museum, the Oklahoma State University Museum, the Textile Museum of Washington, D.C., and Crystal Bridges Museum, among others. Sonya Kelliher-Combs is an artist of Iñupiat from the North Slope of Alaska, Athabascan from interior Alaska, German and Irish descent. Kelliher-Combs strives to create work through a contemporary lens that addresses the importance of traditional knowledge and carries cultural traditions and values of her people, including respect for land, animals, sea, and fellow humans. She draws from historical, familial, and cultural symbolism to form imagery that speaks about abuse, marginalization, and the historical and contemporary struggles of Indigenous peoples. And finally, we've got Jason Lujan, is originally from Marfa, Texas, and has lived in New York City since 2001. His current work creates layered connections using cultural, commercial, and political design, often utilizing visual signifiers rooted in Asia and North America. Previous exhibitions and performances include the Heard Museum in Phoenix, Arizona, the National Museum of the American Indian here in New York, the Curitiba Biennial in Brazil, the Continental des Arts Indigenas Contemporáneas at the Museo Nacional de Culturas Populares in Mexico City, and the Museum of Contemporary Native Art in Santa Fe. So thank you all for being here today. I'll ask Crystal to come on up and start her presentation. Thanks so much.
Ani, Shikenkwe Indigenicas, Chishaktorium, Wiikwemikoong Dunjiba. I'm Crystal Migwans. I'm from Wiikwemikoong unceded territory on Manitoulin Island, in what is now Canada. I'm a doctoral candidate here at Columbia University in the art history department, and I'm currently undertaking my research on natural fiber weaving traditions of the Great Lakes area. So what I'm going to talk about today, it's a little bit of in-progress research. What I'm doing in museum collections, from the museum collections to the community, is a larger project in which I'm trying to find evidence of the maker's hand and ways that Anishinaabe women today can go into the museum and make contact again with those ties that have been deliberately severed. So what I'd like to do in this talk is kind of just briefly introduce my research aims, which are, in brief, the repatriation of a practice, of something living out of something that is still static in the museum. Key to this is the phrase that my collaborator has repeated to me again: I have to remember with my hands. This is something she said to me in the museum as we were looking at a piece and she was trying to figure out how to make it. And She couldn't describe it with words, but the way her hands are moving, and when she went home later that night, she went and tried to replicate it. And only then, after reflection, after her fingers understood it, could the rest of her understand it. She said, I had to remember with my hands. So that's become a central piece of my work, is how remembering with one's hands as a methodology in the museum. So I'm going to introduce Renee there. What I'd like to talk about, especially in the presentation today, is a couple of problems that have sprung up in the research that I've been attempting to do right now. My question today is, who is it standing between us? I take it for granted in some of my work that these objects that are standing before us, as some of us as have mentioned, are elder objects, ancestral objects, things that are alive, and that they are standing there behind us while we're in collections, and they're looking over our shoulders going, yeah, that's how you do it, you just put it over there. Sometimes they're silent, sometimes they don't want to tell you, but there's someone standing there. So this has been an assumption of mine that there's a person there that we are trying to make contact with. So my question that I've been exploring recently is, who is it standing between us? Because it can't always be assumed that there's a direct line of communication. There are other people who are there. And previously I'd been trying to take the approach of, how do we get around these people? How do we weed out their influence in the archive? How do we get rid of all these clamoring voices, this cacophony that confuses us while we're trying to make contact with our grandmothers? So I'm going to be talking a bit about the collectors and how we negotiate with those, and in conclusion, trying to describe an updated version of my methodology, which is about holding hands with our foremothers while learning their lessons and learning about the conditions of making. So first I will introduce Renee Wasson-Dillard, who is my collaborator, an elder teacher. I think is more appropriate to say than informant in this case. This is her at the Bemidji State University just last week. Well, I think that's my nose in there, actually. I'm on the right there. Oh, geez, okay. So she is, in her own words, a former basket case and a current bag lady. She's an elder, an Ottawa or Anishinaabe Kwe from Cross Village, Michigan, which is now Little Traverse Bay Bands of Ottawa. She used to be a basket maker because she and as many in my family and many Anishinaabe Kwe before us have made a living for themselves and their children. They've supported Anishinaabe life by making ash splint basketry, making quill work baskets, making things from the environment around us, from where we live, and making those into things that are saleable to support the continuation of our livelihood. These practices have been threatened by ongoing ecological devastation, by ongoing conditions of colonization. And one of those is the emerald ash borer, which is going to, in the next 20 years, wipe out all the ash trees in North America. There's always a certain amount of hyperbole when we talk about these crafts. It's the death of an art, that this is a death that we are anticipating is coming. And in order to face it, what we're trying to do is move back to crafts that are not practiced anymore, arts that have been discouraged through various colonial institutions and that we'd like to try to return to now. So she's especially focusing on, the piece in front of her is a bulrush mat, and this used to be the art that encapsulated every aspect of Anishinaabe life. This is a floor mat, you would sleep on it. There's different sorts of mats that would cover the lodge, and it's an exquisite and very meditative process, and it's something that I think is about how the Anishinaabe women's labor captures and encapsulates every aspect of the Anishinaabe life. My methodology is, in brief, to find a collection and bring someone who knows what they're talking about into the collection with me, an expert. Usually that would be an academic, but I would argue that the maker is the expert in this case. The maker as well as the person that the maker was trying to keep alive, right? Something I would argue is the object's family members. So Wasson's work is to revitalize natural fiber weaving and to reassert the forms of caring relationships that the practice of it constitutes. At the outset of my collaboration with her, I thought that meant that my role was helping her produce and sell stuff, find a new art form, and find a new market for it to support the ongoing livelihood of our women and people. In any case, my first job was to get her into the collections, and which is an entire dissertation on its own, all right? So I might say, oh yes, my methodology is finding an elder and bringing her to the museum. That's a dissertation. It's, it's hard, it's strange, and it's unnerving, and it's very emotional. These are some photos from one of our more enlivening and successful visits to the Museum of the American Indian, where they are specifically trained to receive people in projects like ours. And here she is making a mess of their conservation lab. She had all of the conservators take off their pants and spin basswood fibers on their thighs so they could understand what they were working with. That's what you do. Your fingers have to understand it, right? It was amazing. Another unexpected moment from our collaboration. So what I'm trying to do is I try to get her in there. We've settled into a bit of a process. We've been through dozens of museums by this point. I go, and my job was to take all these, to document the object in a way that, that I can extract data from, right? So I go and I usually take at least 20 pictures of a single mat, all right? You take one picture of the front overall, you take a picture of the back, you take a picture of the back and the front of each corner, so you can see how she started the selvage. You take a picture of this and this and this. All the things that I have never seen a museum collection capture in their otherwise authoritative collections shots, all right? And what that is Renee tells me, you have to capture where the thread starts and where the thread ends. And I thought, before I went in here, because I'm still really young, but I was like, I'm an expert in this thing. I know bags, I know mats, I thought I knew all these things because I was familiar with how they looked in publications and stuff. I didn't even know how to take a picture that she could get any information out of. So only when I started to learn how to weave could I even see what she was pointing at when she said, look here, this thread is going the wrong way or something. You don't even know how to look without knowing at least a little bit of how it's made. So yeah. So as I was taking pictures, she would usually be down in there getting right in the way and trying to count stitches. Because for her, she's going in there asking the question, how did she do that? And I think that is a fundamentally radical question to ask in a collection. How did she do that? Not only the question being directed at the procedure of it and at the expertise of the maker, but she, addressing this object, not as though, well, in a way the object itself has a spirit, and we might be talking to the object, but she, the person who made it, the person who was standing beyond there, she is addressing someone specifically, and she's trying to learn from them. So I think there's several radical propositions in the question, how did she do that? So she's down there counting stitches, and I'm there taking photos, and then occasionally she turns around and gets a picture of me. I'm sure there's a picture, I guess there must be a picture of me taking a picture of her somewhere. The other thing I think is radical about the way that we conduct research is that, okay, Anishinaabe have big families, all right? So usually when I'm trying to intervene in these museums, I try to do it with as much of I try to get into them a little bit, right? So I contact them and say, hello, I am Crystal Migwans, I'm undertaking my dissertation work at Columbia University. And they're like, oh, the doors open. It's a very strange and unnerving moment when I'm standing back and trying to bring this elder forward into the museum, and her authority, I can see the moment where her authority is discarded, and then I have to step forward and be like, hello, I am the primary investigator. I am here to use this institution, and then it opens up. It's a strange moment, but once we're in there, once we get in there, once I use Columbia's name to get in the door, I'm like, all right, I opened the door, and they didn't realize that they were inviting an entire caravan of Migwanses into the museum, because I don't know, these kids weren't doing anything that week. I was like, get in the car, we're going to Minnesota. So this is my brother and sister, and here they are learning from things that otherwise I would just be keeping for myself. Like, this might be my education, but it's actually, like, my entire family is getting educated from what I bring back to them, right? So we bring in an elder, and I bring the kids, and we got a bunch of food, and that's a problem. We have to, we bring a wheelchair, we bring our photo paper, we bring our entire setup, and we get in there, and we get on their nerves. I think it's a good experience for them, but again, that's a dissertation. These are some examples of what it is that we were looking for. So another problem that I have to kind of rethink my approach to is I'm going and expecting a certain kind of object, right? So I'm like, this is the traditional object. This is how we used to do it. So something like this, which is a bag right from around where Renee's from. It's an unknown Adamo women's work collected from Saginaw, Michigan about the turn of the century. It's currently here in New York, the American Museum of Natural History. And this is what you would call a space-twined bag. This particular way of making it is it's very portable. You can make it just with your hands on a couple of sticks. Usually on one side you have the representations of the above world powers, and on the other side you have representations of the underworld. And these are conventionalized or abstracted to a certain degree, but they always have a duality, a certain story. They're never the same on both sides. This is an example of Renee's work here, because while I'm trying to figure out trying to capture all this other information, she's trying to go in, she's trying to count and trying to get her fingers in there, right? Sometimes the work is easy, and sometimes you can get right in there and they let us just make contact with that, and there's no moment of disconnect. Another thing I've learned is that the museum is not a site where past wrongs are collected and that we need to that they're a site that we need to find ways to remake our relations. They're a site of ongoing violence and incision. Every time a conservator comes in and goes, "No, wait, put on the gloves," there's an assertion of authority, an assertion of primacy in every interaction that happens in the museum. And some of them are more overt than others. But I think one of those has to be conservators standing back or standing out of the room and letting the literal contact of our hands on the objects happen. I think this is one of the primary moments where primary tests of how a relationship is going to go is, can our hands touch the object? Because that's where that makes it so much more easy than going through the archives 5 different times. And anyway, so the end result of all this work, the process of us going to the museum, doing this research, making a mess, is that then we come out and we try to replicate some of those techniques. We try to understand them in some way. We do it with our hands, right? So we sit down afterwards and we eat and we try to weave it out. Ideally, we go and we hang out with some other people and try to teach it to them. Because as another thing Renee says, you can only learn it, you can only keep it by giving it away. Only when you understand how to explain it to someone do you actually have it in your head. So we sit down and we try to do it. So here she is with the students at Bemidji Folk School. This is a couple days after we went into that collection, and we were able to say, hey, these are some pieces from the people in this area. All right, so now we get to I would like to introduce some problem objects that were a bit challenging for me to approach. How is my time? Okay, I've got 5 minutes, good. We have a couple of problem objects that I came across. On the left is something the thing that I was expecting to find. This is an Anishinaabe yarn bag. It would have been a piece to put personal items in. It also doubles as a pillow, so it's for your personal items when you're in the lodge. All the mats on the floor, there's one family per mat, and then each person's personal objects go in this bag, and that is their pillow. So that is the sort of thing I was expecting to find. It's made of yarn, but it's very Anishinaabe. It's bright, it's dynamic, it's different on both sides. It tells a story. Thank you, 5 minutes. There's a certain amount of, in later pieces you'll be able to see it more clearly, but there's a certain figure ground oscillation. There's a certain dynamism that it actually speaks to, though we can't really see this very division between above world and below world. There's an oscillation between levels of states of being that is a theme in every bag I've encountered. On the right is a weird old thing, okay? Because these yarn bags are hard to make. They take forever to make. They are a precious, personal object. So Renee looked at this bag with the plastic handle on it and went, what the heck? We looked at the collections information. It was made by an Emily broker from White Earth. So the bag was made by an Anishinaabe lady from White Earth. And then the collector put a purse handle on it, which is great. Renee was almost offended. She was like, I would never, this isn't a purse. This isn't a purse, it's Especially it's not, she said, like, I wouldn't make something like this to sell. That's actually clearly what it was meant to be, was something to be sold. Here's some other strange objects. We have on the left some basswood dolls, which is a common thing. I see lots of basswood dolls. Basswood is one of our key natural fibers, but they have faces on them. They have faces written on them I think it's some sort of waxy crayon. We also have a bulrush basket, which is another strange object, and a basswood bag, which is much like the yarn bag, except made out of hand-spun basswood fiber. This one's interesting because at the corner we can see there's a bag. I don't know, oh, you can't quite see it, but there's a price tag on it, and it says $25. So Renee was looking at all these objects. Oh, and here's my favorite, okay. An unexpected object. For someone who was going in looking for traditional arts, natural fiber weaving, this is the most Anishinaabe thing I'd seen there all day. It was strange because I wasn't expecting a rag rug, but after some looking, these aren't entirely unfamiliar objects. So there's something to be learned from them still. The rag rug, for example, in all the archival digging I've done, I haven't seen a lot of documentation of these women using the natural fiber, the basswood and the bulrush rugs, while they're sitting and working. They would have had them before, but now they're replaced by these rag rugs, which was part of a WPA project in the early part of the 20th century that encouraged them to turn from these other forms of natural fiber weaving into something that the production of which could be more tightly controlled. And so they would do rag rugs in exchange for rations throughout the early part of the 20th century. And they are familiar objects. The oscillation of the figure in the ground, the way that these abstract images seem to like it's hard to look at. That is so Anishinaabe, making something so brilliant that it's actually hard to look at. Even the designs of it reflect some of the earlier arts, such as this cedar bag that's on the right. Okay, this is another example of a strange object. I'm gonna have to skip this story for now. Once we start going through the archives, we start realizing that these objects that the people standing between us and kind of influencing how these arts are coming down to us from our mothers are the collectors and the anthropologists and the missionaries who are trying to determine what these Anishinaabe arts mean, what they should mean, and what they should, how they should figure in our lives. That's it, eh? Okay. Okay, lost my thread. The first object that I was showing you earlier, I'll go back here, is actually one piece of many in this Karen Peterson collection. And she was initially a housewife and somebody who was really interested in Indian welfare in the 50s and 60s, the 1950s and 60s. And what she initiated a project where she really wanted to help the Indians of Minnesota. And so she started trying to find a way to make their handiwork marketable. All these different pieces in the collection, all these very strange experimental pieces were ways that she was trying to find objects that would work, that would sell, basically to her circle, to church ladies, I guess. She was going to sell them in her Episcopalian church networks and send all the proceeds to the makers, which is a great idea. But Renee looked at this piece and she said, that would take me a couple weeks to make, and I would never put a price tag on it. I would never put a handle on it like that, let alone make a price tag for it. So I'm gonna have to wrap up quicker, but what I think, after looking at these objects and finding evidence of how the women were trying to fit themselves into a market economy, all these objects, though they are familiar and they're evidence of how our mothers continued to strive to find ways to make us fit into the modernity that was progressing and closing in around them. The more Renee was looking at these, she's like, it became clear to me that my role is not to try to find a way to make her market ready as well, but to kind of find a way to make these arts come back into our communities rather than going on a trajectory out into a market, right? These things have to come home in some way. So, oh my God. Let's go through all these. At the end of this, what we actually found names attached to these. There's this one, the rag rug and those baskets and the mats were all made by this woman called, in the record, was called just Mudway. And after some digging, we found that her full name was Omadwe Bigashikwe, which we're still trying to figure out what it means because it's Western Anishinaabe and they have so many vowels. I don't know how. They talk weird. We're trying to figure out what it means. But we found this woman, okay. If I'm going to summarize everything I have to say in the last few minutes, whenever we try to look for these women, whenever I try to go and find these women and try to push aside all the other people that are standing around her and grabbing onto her and trying to say, no, you have to make it this for the market, you have to make this for market, I think we have to resist the urge to kind of ignore those or try to weed those away from idea of what the object is and who the woman is and what it is that we're connecting with, because that is actually this is our reality today. Those historical conditions are not a traditional kind of, there was never ever something before this, before these traders, before the people who are in between. The more and more I tried to go back and be like, all right, well, this is obviously a fraught collection. We'll have to just go back and start again. We have to go back to an earlier time or something. There never was a point where these intermediaries, where these people, where there is an undiluted Anishinaabe-ness happening that we can go back to and say, this is the tradition we're going back to. We have to go and say, all the things these women went through are things that we're going through today. We have to learn from the lessons that they went through, and we have to come out and be part of a very complex and very fraught ongoing strategy for surviving in what is still a very fraught modernity. Anyway, okay. Thank you, Miigwech.
Hi, everybody. My name is Sonya Kelliher-Combs. My Iñupiat name is Asyangatuk. I'm named after my great-grandmother from Utkiyavik, formerly known as Barrow. And I want to thank Elizabeth and company for allowing me a chance to share some of my work with you. I'm not showing any of my visual art. I'm showing the work that I do in museums. I consider this a part of my practice. I like to do social kind of work, like getting the community into collections, inviting them to participate, breaking down barriers and boundaries, and this is what this body of work is about. But before I start talking, I'm going to tell you a little bit about where I'm from. I'm from Alaska, raised in Nome, Alaska, born and bred there. And this is the tundra in Nome. And this is the frozen Bering Sea. These are pictures probably maybe 15 years ago. Now we all know with climate change it has changed quite dramatically. The ocean doesn't freeze as hard. We have a harder time getting our food and other things from the land. And this is our summer home where 6 children, 5 siblings of mine, and my parents spent our entire summers. It's a beautiful way to live off the land. We didn't have running water or electricity. And it's because of this experience growing up this way that after I went to undergrad at the University of Alaska Fairbanks and graduate school at Arizona State University, that I made the decision to live in Alaska and be an artist there. These are some pictures. I like to show pictures of my family. So the little guy in the sled is my dad, Patrick Kelliher, and his 2 siblings, and my grandma Kelliher, Peggy. And then on the opposite side, I'm sorry, I'm really bad with left and right, so you guys, I just have to do this, and my sister's out there laughing at me. But so on the other side is my mom's family, and she was adopted into this family. It's her aunt and uncle that raised her because her mom died from TB. And she's that cute little girl at the bottom there. Her name is Gertrude Hildebrand Kelliher, and her nickname was Dumplings. And so you can see why she's named Dumplings, because she's so cute. So if I was going to talk about my work, I'd start talking about the objects, the material culture of our people, but I want to kind of move on because I might run out of time. So I'm very fortunate that I have a dad and a father, and this is my father when he was younger. Now his hair is white, Jim Stotts, and that's my grandmother in the parka, and my great uncle, Mary Brower, and Jim Stotts. Okay, so now I can get to this other good stuff here. I have notes because I don't want to forget anything. So this is an exhibition I curated at the Anchorage Museum. I think that I'm very fortunate that I've had the opportunity to go into a number of museums and look at objects. And part of my job, I feel, as an artist who has these opportunities is to create opportunities for other artists. So my intention for curating this Points of View exhibition series, which is something that the Anchorage Museum continues to do. I think they've had 5 artists come in. It's every 3 to 4 years to go through the collection and select objects and install them from the beginning to the end. Anyhow, my intention was to create a show that addressed many issues that are close to my heart. And in working on this exhibition, it became clear that I wanted to say something with the items I selected. As single objects, they might speak softly about history, culture, family, and the life of our people, but collectively, they could speak loudly about abuse, marginalization, commodification, and struggles of our peoples. My goal was to present a conceptual installation that was unconventional, and as I continued to work, it became a personal exploration of the transformative power of these utilitarian objects. So in the foreground, you see, forgive you, Father, for you have sinned, is for those who have suffered the wounds and abuse of the clergy and the church. The total number of those who were scarred by the hands of those whom were sent to save them will never be known. And this piece is Overflow. Contemporary Alaska Native people have experienced both positive and negative exposure to religion and the effects of colonization, and have lived with historical trauma as well as identity issues, loss of identity. These vacancies seem to have been replaced by negative life patterns, including addictions. Overflow addresses the issue of alcoholism and the effects on culture, health, and continuity. So goodbye is a memorial to those who have lost their lives to suicide. There are so many parallels through everybody's presentations. I'm just so moved. To those who have lost their life to suicide, this personal and deeply wounding experience has affected every person we know. Our family has personally lost 3 uncles and 3 cousins to suicide. In this exhibition, there were 38 pairs of gloves and mittens representing those Alaska Natives who died by their own hand in 2005. So this exhibition was in 2007. This is the beginning of me coming into collections and having this opportunity. And it was such an amazing experience. You've heard it from everybody else. Words can't express being able to have access to these materials. Alaska is 2 times above the national average in the rate of suicide, but Alaska Natives are 3 times the national average to take their own lives. And something that's important to me is I think that we need to voice these issues, and a lot of times it's considered taboo, but we need to voice them in order to help promote the healing and understanding and connection between our communities. That this thing is, we've lost some celebrities this year, so now suicide is really hot. But we've been talking about it for a long time. So anyhow, let's move on here. Okay, so another wonderful opportunity I had was I was given a artist leadership program from the National Museum of the American Indian, and that program was created to rebuild cultural self-confidence, challenge personal boundaries, and foster cultural continuity while reflecting artistic diversity. The program's goal, having included recognizing and promoting Indigenous artistic leadership, at the same time the program has sought to enhance the artistic growth, development, and leadership of emerging student artists and scholars through workshops in artist communities. So what happened is a grant was given to the Sheldon Jackson Museum, and I was selected. I think we had 6 in our class, and we were able to go to the Sheldon Jackson Museum in Sitka, Alaska, and study the collection. And then as a result of that, we went back to our communities and did a community project. It was, again, amazing and transformative. And this is Art Umatuk in this picture. I was fortunate to have another artist there when I was there. And so we were just bouncing off each other. It was so amazing to share information. And, you know, he identified, he's from Point Hope, a bunch of burial masks that should not be available to the public. They should not be out there. They should be in a special box away and marked so that, you know, they need to go back to the ground as far as I'm concerned. Anyhow, so let's move on here. Okay. So I have continued to find inspiration in the objects and lifeways of our ancestors. Studying these collections provides invaluable insight. Sharing these opportunities with students and other artists is important. This leadership program allowed me to collaborate with the Smithsonian Arctic Studies Center, the Anchorage Museum, Alaska Native Arts Foundation, and the Alaska Native Heritage Center. We brought artists and students into collections and created work that was inspired by this experience. It was so fantastic to have some time in these amazing collections and to bring these organizations together and, you know, help to expand, you know, the programming by collaborating. And I really find you know, this is really important to work for me, and I really find inspiration in just connecting people to, not just to objects, but to each other. And as we've been talking about today, making is such an important thing. I mean, I have this little group that gets together. They call it Sonya's Sweatshop. But we come together and we bring things in and we make things. And it's such an amazing, I just met with the students in the program here, the Native American students, and we just sat and beaded the other day, and it was so beautiful. And I really do agree that it's meditative, it's healing, working together and bringing, you know, so anyhow, I could go on and on about that, but so we'll move on. So some of these this is Ken Lisburn, he passed a year ago now, but this is one of the pieces that he created as a result of going through the collection. We also used contemporary materials, so we were looking at materials that were more historic or customary, and then also using, this is an acrylic painting, so, so the students, they have this amazing program at the Alaska Native Heritage Center. It's like an after-school program, and a lot of these are urban kids who grew up in the city and don't really have any, you know, tangible connection to their material culture. So the Heritage Center does this great program where these students come in, they learn how to dance, they learn how to make things in customary materials. You know, they spend time with elders, and if sometimes they work there, and during the summertime they learn how to smoke fish and you know, cut fish, and sometimes they have like seal, like demonstrations on butchering seal and making moose hide, all these wonderful programs. And so I'm so happy that they have that program, but I was able to help, you know, go into that program and bring the students to go look at these things and share that as well. Okay, this is another fun thing I did this is strictly at the Anchorage Museum. This is a part of their polar lab, and it's called Out of the Box. That I was given the opportunity to do a polar lab intervention in response to Captain Cook's exhibition that was at the Anchorage Museum, and I didn't want it to just be about me, so I invited 15 Alaska Native participants, and this series presents Indigenous perspectives on the legacy of Captain Cook's voyages. Out of the box, artists challenge stereotypes by using cardboard boxes to represent the metaphorical boxes society places on Alaska Native peoples. Viewers became participants in Sarah Whalen's piece, confronted the secrecy and shame that enshrouds domestic violence by inviting passerbys to write their own personal stories on her box. Their words were then cut out and placed inside and above the work until the box is gradually opened up, because the more we share, the more the box disappears. And that's what I'm all about. We need to get this stuff out there. We need to connect to each other. It's so important. Okay, this is Allison Warden. And she's really fun, you can tell, huh? So, Allison Warden, The Place of the Future Ancient, was an interdisciplinary performance creating a space where the hyper-future meets the super-ancient, a liminal space where myths are born. After this out-of-the-box performance, she continued to work on her solo exhibition at the Anchorage Museum called The Place of the Future Ancient, where she constructed an Iñupiat ceremonial house on the museum's 4th floor. Warden's futuristic version allows her audience to explore long-standing cultural ideas in a contemporary context. She's so amazing. We were talking about indigenize everything, right? She's trying to make everybody a Iñupiat. Everybody's going to be a Iñupiat. And that's her goal, and that's what she's doing. And she's a rapper, she's a performance artist, she runs a dance group. I mean, she's just amazing, amazing. Actually, one of the things she did was she did rap concerts, poetry readings, dance parties, native dance sessions, discussion series called Let's Get Uncomfortable. I think Allison, my sister, was in one of those, but yeah, I wasn't ready to get uncomfortable, actually. So, okay, so let's go to this one. Okay. I'll let you guys look at that for a second. So this is Eskimo Pie by Holly Nordlum and Priscilla Hensley. Holly states this work addresses the stereotypes of Native women, including the degradation, exotification, and exploitation that often define our sexual identity. She's an Iñupiat visual artist originally from Kotzebue. Her work reflects where she comes from, but also who she is as a Native person, an American, a mother, and just a regular woman. And she is also doing some wonderful work at the Anchorage Museum. She is doing, she's the brainchild of Tupik-Mi, which is traditional Inuit tattoo revitalization. She's working with a Greenlandic tattoo artist, and every 2 years, 5 minutes, oh my gosh. Okay, quickly, okay. Anyhow, she's so amazing. So another thing I'm doing with museums is getting an opportunity to curate conversations. And I did this for 2 years. It focused on issues important to contemporary and future circumpolar North, and in particular that of Indigenous people. And this image is from our third conversation, Culture of Commodity, Commodity of Culture. And yeah, it was fantastic. It was an amazing project. I'm gonna move on here. Another one was Edges. As Indigenous people continue to respond to the legacies of imperialism, some boundaries have fallen. While new ones rise up, others disappear, and some old boundaries remain as impenetrable as ever. Boundaries and borders have often operated as the moving frontiers of modernity and state power. This panel discussed imperial legacies, modern land claims, and the erasure of Indigenous place names. They also considered strategies for redrawing and erasing boundaries written on the land. As part of the conversations, we were also allowed for installation performance by some of the participants. They were fantastic. Here are two. I Was Not Discovered by Deka Heinmaner, and Homage to Soil for Skoresponsend by Jesse Kleeman. Kleeman's performance strives to provoke collective experiences while the artist viewer and raw materials, creating a space where the structural power can be unsettled. Over the course of the day, Deka created a pop-up installation of large steel sculptures based on Tlingit warrior knives trapping the Captain Cook statue. This is a reminder of the history that was here before Cook and recognizing the continual cultural landscape that is Alaska today. So these conversations took place all over Alaska, New Mexico, New York, Norway, and were aired on the World Wide Web. Wow, huh? The culmination of these was the exhibition Without Boundaries, Visual Conversations. It opened in Anchorage, it traveled to rural Alaska, and the IAIA Museum of Contemporary and Native Art in Santa Fe. So we actually had a catalog, and it should be online if you guys are interested. So it featured Indigenous voices and the work of contemporary artists who, through their work, inform and encourage social action. I brought together artists, scholars, and leaders from Alaska and around the world to create a shared visual narrative and a shared conversation about ideas and issues that separate and bind. Here's one of these pieces. There's Native Hosts by Edgar Heap of Birds, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. Here's Unexpected Gift by Shan Gossorn. Boarding schools, she's so amazing, I just miss her so much. Boarding schools are often viewed as a crushing detriment to Native culture, the removal of children from loving homes to and assimilated into white society. However, Shan also sees a positive influence, the relationship formed among students as a result of their shared struggle. And this is my last slide, idle no more, which we won't be idle no more. So, thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for coming, especially my colleagues at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. There's a lot of work waiting for you when you get back. We all know it. So the presentation I'm giving is different than the usual kind of presentation I give as an artist. Like many of the artists in this room, I think we can probably roll out of bed and give a presentation about our work. This one is specifically for this event and for this audience. So please forgive me if I stumble. It's not the usual kind of presentation that I give. This is the only artwork I think I'll be showing today. So last year, a friend recommended that I read a collected group of studio notes from the African American artist Jack Whitten. He's a black man who grew up in the Jim Crow South, died last year, arrived in New York in 1959, and began a wide-ranging exploration into the nature of painting. And I'll refer to his notes a couple of times today. By chance, I was also able to see an exhibition of his sculptures at the Met Brewer that closed early December. So the way I read his book was because it's notes, I would hold on to it, and occasionally when I had a spare moment, I would open the book to just any random page, and I would read a couple of notes, and that would be kind of cool, and I would move on. However, after a while, as I opened the book, I kept finding myself on the same set of pages. And one of the pages from 1976 that kept catching my attention, that my eye kept scanning, was a particular sentence that said, I try to emphasize as much as possible the need for black artists to go all the way now, not stopping at social realism, but to press ahead and investigate what the world of abstract art has to offer. And I kept finding myself thinking about that word social realism. I never really thought about it much. Of course, I studied it when you study art history. And as an artist, I'd spent a lot of time trying to dodge being instrumentalized or essentialized by institutions and anthropologists who were dipping their toes into the contemporary art world. But I never really thought about expectations of Native art. And so I began to wonder if all Native art, regardless of the artist's intent or style, was understood by outside consensus as being explicitly political. And so that phrase is the starting point for this presentation, which is less a narrative than just a series of thoughts and ideas and anecdotes as I move forward that I'll bring forward and possibly work through given time. One of the things about talking and giving personal anecdotes is that as you're giving one anecdote, your brain is yelling at you and going after you for all the things, all the nuance and all the other things that you're possibly missing. So this is going to be kind of tough. This is a Jack Whitten painting from 1972. So when I say Native art, I'm specifically referring to a very specific set of circumstances, and I'm referring to contemporary art made by people who are American Indian. A certain level of career of university-trained people who look at other contemporary art and interact with a network of museums, galleries, and art fairs. In essence, trying to present a particular content for a global audience or commercial audience. Oh, speaking of Jack Whitten, I'm going to go back. See, it happened. One of the things about his notes is that I was reading the liner notes, and they had mentioned that some of his notes, these notes were incomplete. He had made some writings for lack of a better word, not very constructive comments about some of his colleagues. He did mention his colleagues, but some of the ones where he berated them in his writings, they decided were not very constructive. So they excised. I was kind of disappointed in that. So I've lived in New York since 2001. My first job was with the Dia Art Foundation. I lived in New York for 3 weeks and was hired by a California transplant named John Boucher, who worked for Dia. Great guy. He began my entire professional career in museums. One of the things I think it's important to do is recognize your allies, native and non-native. And I owe him a debt of gratitude for hiring me and getting me on this path. My professional museum career is separate from my art practice. And I think that's one of the reasons I was asked to speak here. There are plenty of New York artists who are native, who are very successful, could give a great presentation. But perhaps being on both sides, being an artist, producing work, trying to get that out there in a particular context, and then being on the other end, working at various museums. I'm not going to go through the whole CV, you know, Dia, MoMA, United Nations, the Metropolitan Museum. There's others in there somewhere. I think maybe there's these anecdotes. So Dia. So I was hired and I began working, and after a while, one of the things that the director would sometimes do in other staff is they would bring people by my office and they'd say, hey, this is Jason, guys. He's from Marfa. This is a picture of my home from Marfa, my grandmother's home. It's a nice little adobe house with a tin roof. It's my mother's truck in the driveway. This picture is from Google Maps, actually. I haven't been there since winter, 2-3 years ago when I brought my wife to meet my family. Anyway, and it was really weird because the thing about Marfa, and for those of you who aren't familiar with Marfa, it's a pilgrimage site built around the cult of personality of Donald Judd, who's a famous minimalist. And people would meet me and they'd say, oh, you're from Marfa. I love Marfa. I really want to go there. And there'd be this kind of, a few things, a few sentences, and then common etiquette would dictate that they need to ask me about Marfa. What do you think about Marfa? And as I began telling them a few things about myself and Marfa, I could slowly see the interest in their eyes begin to fade. They had already done their job in telling me that they were in the know on Marfa. They understood Marfa. They knew about it. And so as a result, as I began my art practice soon afterwards here in New York, I decided that I didn't want to speak about personal matters. If you look at my artwork, and I'm not showing any today, you won't see anything about Apache country, Apacheria, anything like that. I prefer to talk about larger issues, different issues. There's plenty of groundwork being laid, and I really appreciate the work around traditional art, contemporary arts, that allows me the room to move around and diversify. Anyway, one of the things about being a professional in 20 years is that few people actually know I'm Native until much later into the job. They assume I'm something else, or it just never comes up. I'm valued, and it's a point of pride that I feel valued for a skill set or an expertise that is not tied to my ethnicity. People don't come to me because I'm Indian, they come to me because they need something fixed. And I often find myself asking, well, if I can operate that way as an arts professional, why can't I necessarily operate that way as an artist? Why must the identity always be foregrounded with everything else in service to it? There it is, I just brought it up, and now we'll move on. So this map's been seeing a lot of action lately. All my American Wing Met peeps know and love this map. So the reason I brought this map is because I went to a lecture earlier this February with Aaron Glass and Jolene Ricard, and I had such a great time. It was such a great talk. It was very informative. It dealt with very serious issues, problems, but without sucking the energy out of the room. So I kind of want to get this, I want to show this map around some more. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about it. We all know its pluses and minuses. Suffice to say, though, that this is the kind of map you'll often see when you go to a historical exhibition of objects, moccasins, baskets, things like that. However, as an anthropological tool, I've often seen it in contemporary Native art exhibitions too, which is kind of weird. Let me find my notes. So, there are these expectations around cultural fixity. For example, I'm from the Southwest. I'm from this dark brown area. But of course, I live up here in New York City, which is the green area. And there are these expectations, particularly among those who are not art professionals, that my work should more reflect the area I'm from, the brown area. The other end of that, for artists, for dealing with art professionals, is they see the American Indigenous map like this, just one color. They have an idea of a very fixed idea of what it means to be Indigenous, and this applies to everything, everywhere. And I chose that color particularly because it seems to me that they all expect war bonnets at some point. And as a result, you have these kinds of things where artworks that deal with nuanced global themes are reduced to these essentialist expectations. I've never actually seen anything like this with other contemporary artists. When you go to a Gerhard Richter show, it's not a map of Germany there. There's nothing like that. The other thing I want to bring up when dealing with museums is that I've often been in exhibiting with museums is that oftentimes they will mix traditional art with contemporary art. The expectation is that the new stuff is supposed to do the same job as the old stuff. I spend a lot of time talking about languages. My very patient wife, and I'll refer to her often to this talk too, she gets to hear me sound like a broken record all the time talking about languages. And one of the things with Indian countries that's brought up is the disappearance of native languages. But artists have a language too. We have a material of vocabulary and process. And each artist has a specific language. And when you die, that language dies with you. Let me find myself on these notes. And it's important to understand that. So when traditional objects, contemporary art objects, different conversation, different language. Now it's entirely possible for contemporary artists to use the traditional object as a point of departure, but then one is changing the language. The times and circumstances that existed then do not exist now. The body of knowledge, the experience are different. I have a second note here. Oh, okay. So this note says, curatorial decisions centered around identity renders us interchangeable. And this is what this map illustrates. So one of the things about living in New York is eventually every Indian artist in the world passes through here. You know, there's group shows, we hang out. After the show, hey, where's everybody going? All right, I'll meet you there. So we go. And one of the most common conversations that I have is with artists who express a kind of friendly envy at this perceived freedom of being an artist here in New York City, especially in Canada, where everything is a state-subsidized experience, which is code for social realist output tends to be rewarded with exhibitions and funding. And then generally, these kinds of people who express envy at this perceived freedom fall into two groups. The first kind are, and I'm just going to be blunt, are non-natives who now face scrutiny because through some level of success, people have begun asking questions about them. These are all the people whose parents we've never met. We all know who they are. We know who you are. As they become more successful, people begin asking questions. People want to know more about them. And so now they kind of want to pivot. The heat's on. They're thinking, oh, I got to change styles. I can't talk about Indian country anymore. Jason, how do you have the freedom to talk about anything you want in New York City? I wish I could do that. These problems eventually work themselves out. Unable to survive in bigger waters, these non-natives grind it out in Indian 101 shows for the rest of their lives, most of the time. Natives, and the other kind, are natives who have spent a long time developing a certain brand and now feel typecast. I want to be creatively free, they say. They complain that they had an exhibition where they tried out some new work, and then there was an art review in a magazine, and all the review did was mention work from their previous exhibitions, or talk about them in a particular framework. And they dislike that. They want it to be talked about as something that's fresh, the work that's being made now. And there's a cautionary tale in there, because I think Kathleen, we were at a conference, and Kathleen Ashmilby, she's here today, she did mention that writers tend to be lazy, and I know there are some writers here. But they'll Google your name, they'll pick up whatever you've been saying the last 5 years, and they'll just kind of paste that into the press release. Anyway, oftentimes with these conversations, I kind of feel like squeezed like a tube of toothpaste from our resources. And I wonder if these artists have conversations with non-native artists in the same way. or if non-native artists have these conversations with other non-native artists asking about pivoting, changing direction, and what those circumstances are. In reading Jack Whitten's notes, there was a lot of grief in that he expressed he wanted to be accepted as an abstract painter. He didn't want his identity foregrounded. He didn't want to be seen as a black African-American artist informing his work. He wanted the work to stand on its own. And I get that. Okay, so this section is titled Experiences with Museum Staff. As you've seen from today's panels, there's a wide range of different kinds of levels of expertise, different levels of experience, different levels of focus, niches of knowledge. My sometimes experience with museum staff is they will sometimes quiz me. People will quiz me when they find out I'm Native, and then they are frustrated when I don't know every nuance about Indian country. I'm expected to represent not just myself, but all of the United States and all of the definitions around the world. Sometimes I'll run into someone from New York City who asks questions, outside of New York City. I'll be in Canada, I'll be somewhere else, and they'll say, hey, oh, you're from New York. Is that deli still here on this corner? Is this thing still here? Is this thing still? And if I don't know, they don't get upset with me. They just kind of take it and they move on. I have a particular anecdote with a Met staffer I had recently. We were working in December, we were staying late because there was a Karl Lagerfeld fashion show happening. And a lot of long hours. And we were walking by because we decided it was going to be a late night. Oh, you have some whiskey in your office? Okay, cool, let's go. So we go over to have a drink. And as we're walking through a holding space, there were some Apache violins there. And I just kind of said, oh, by the way, if the museum ever wants someone to play these, I've got just the person. Oh, wait, do you have native blood? Yeah. He then began to quiz me. He began to tell me about his time studying Indians, and oh man, all right, I'm not going to mention any names just for plausible deniability reasons. And generally, when I feel that I'm being squeezed like a tube of toothpaste, I just pretend to not know. I go, I don't know what that means. And he began to become really frustrated. And began to raise his voice at me, and it was actually really uncomfortable because I just was not meeting his expectations on what an Indian should know. And at a certain point, I was getting ready for him to begin to tell me that he knows more about Indians than I do. But that actually never happened, and in the end, we just had our drink and friendly chat, and then I scurried back to the show. Recently, I went to a conference last year where people were talking about Indians being used as a resource to give permission. So a projection of social political stances, right? Say yes or no. And some of us have had that experience where someone comes up to you from a museum, at a museum, or with a museum, and they have what is basically a really bad idea. But they're looking for an Indian to sign off on it. So that way when the heat comes on, they can go, well, hey, I've got this person, and the community signed off. It's great, and you're separate from that. And what do you do in those situations? Do you say yes? Do you say no? And one of the people in the audience said, well, she yelled out, you say no, and then there was applause because everyone kind of thought that was a great resistant answer. However, when you say no, depending on the delivery, you run the risk of them just doing it anyway, and then you've completely isolated yourself. You have no recourse, you can't go back. And how am I doing on time? All right, good, so I'll wrap it up. So I'm going to wrap up by reading another Jack Whitten quote. It's a bit longer, and it should use up the rest of my time. April 20th, 1976. Last evening, I went to the opening of Selected Black Artist from the Metropolitan Museum collection of the Bedford-Stuyvesant Restoration Corps in Brooklyn. I really hate Brooklyn, but was curious to see the show. It was the usual presentation, but with the exception. There was a very tough, resistant Jack Whitten from 1975. The picture really holds up, a complicated, very complex, intriguing painting. My painting was exhibited alone, removed from the rest of the exhibition. When entering the doorway, it confronts you, square in the middle. The other works were by J. Lawrence, Bearden, Woodruff, Alston, a Bradley etching, Van der Zee, photographs, and a Chaser-Bow drawing. There was a very good Bearden and a Lawrence and a Palmer Hayden, and the Palmer Hayden was wonderful in an ethnic manner. there remains a strong need for works from Black artists, stronger, more exciting abstract painters. I remain confused about being represented in this show of this nature, not me, but having the painting there under the particular circumstance. Henry purchased the painting directly from my studio for $2,000, which as far as my market today goes, it represents a fair price. The painting is part of the Metropolitan's collection. The museum purchased the painting in order to use it as a political vehicle. The painting will always be used in shows of this type so that the Metropolitan can say, look, we have one. Indeed, they have one, but what does this do for me? Does this represent a special category for me, the most accepted black abstract artist, the pawn to keep the mass at bay? Will this painting be shown in regular museum shows at the Metropolitan as a representation of current American abstract painting? My being Black forces me into the political arena, and I must gear myself to think in art politics, to deal in order to protect my financial growth and integrity as an artist. Realizing the use that the Metropolitan has intended for my painting, surely $2,000 is peanuts. Thank you.
So for those audience members, you'll see on the program that we've got some discussion for this panel until about 4:15, and then we'll do an open discussion to consider the day as a whole. So thank you so much for all of your presentations, and I was really struck by the number of times when I wanted to burst into tears during all of your talks, and I think that there's something in there that has kind of brought up some questions for me, and so I feel like I'm getting weird feedback. I'm really sorry. I'm going to try to fix that. So I kind of want to be a little bit selfish and ask a muddled question that I think there's a reason why I haven't quite been able to suss out this question for myself. And I'm rambling a bit. Sam Slater, who opened up the day, started us by looking around this room, and for him, he was really productively thinking about ways that he could find or locate home in this space, but also these institutions that have been really kind of painful and hostile institutions for Native people. And so when I was trying to think about the question that I would start you all off on was to think about like how and where we locate home within these spaces, within your work and within collections. And the reason why I think the question was so hard for me to formulate was because there are so many different places that home gets located, right? Home gets located in our territories, it gets located in our bodies, it gets located in our fingers and our memories. And so this is just a really overly complicated way of asking you all to start us off by thinking a little bit about like how and where home might be located or found in these kinds of spaces that we often find ourselves that can be quite painful spaces.
I think that's a really hard question for me because, you know, I made a conscious decision to move back to where my home is. And when I travel around and do residencies and stuff, I always bring part of home with me. And part of that is objects that bring me to that place and center me, foods, pictures. So I feel like, you know, when you're far away from that place that centers you, you have to find some way to kind of bring it with you. And it's not just this being that's me. It's more than that. It's a way of looking and seeing and interacting with the place you're at and the people that you're around. And that's how, I mean, this experience, you made me feel like I'm, you know, home because, you know, we had food, we made things, we talked. People are, you know, taking time to listen to each other and share. So that's kind of, I guess, what makes home.
All right, I guess I'll go. So I guess perhaps I'm an outlier because I didn't move here to New York City to worry about home. I moved here to be an artist specifically, and I enjoy the differences between here and home.
Yeah.
It often baffles me when I have people, not native people, just other people from outside, other artists, they move to New York City, and then when you meet them later, they complain how much this is what they miss from home. Oh, I really can't see, the ocean from New York, or whatever, the Pacific Ocean. And I'm like, well, this is not what you came here for. And I embrace the differences here and all possibilities. And then one of the things about living in New York that I really like is that I really love leaving New York City. But then I also really love coming back. And so that's pretty much the internal dialogue I have about home here.
Okay.
So I guess I bring home with me. It's always with me. And I refer to it if I need to, if I'm lost or out of balance, I try to recenter with home. But I'm also a mixed blood who grew up on Wind River Reservation among the Shoshone. So I know what it's like to be, I'm on the outside of white Indian, and I'm on the outside of my native people too, because I didn't grow up back home in Oklahoma. So I guess home for me is the story. That's what it is. I know home. I can see them. I can see them up there, and I know where I'm at. So then it's just like a centering thing. I don't know if that answers that.
I'm gonna go back to Jason's presentation, doing the map with all our cultural areas in different colors there, and the boundaries between there. And he's like, "Well, I'm down from the brown area, but now I'm in the green area." So, but it resonated with something I think Sherry said last night during the seminar, when you're talking about finding your Métis relatives, right? And finding out where we're from. But going into these museum archives and dealing with these imposed cultural boundaries, and you have the process of finding home or finding yourself in the museum archive is this reconstruction of this body that's been cut apart, right, by these dividing lines. So I was just thinking about how the home being like the place that you have a claim on, or that has a claim on you, right? And locating that geographically being itself such a reconstructive, like Frankensteinian project, especially when you're dealing in the museum. When you're going looking for home in a museum, you have to go find all the pieces of it all scattered around there, all in the archive, all in the record, and you have to reconstruct it into something. And some of us, I guess, can do that. There's so much loss already implicated in that process every step of the way, right? So dealing with home and dealing with like finding something to connect with in the collection is a process of experiencing just constant ongoing loss and anger, and those things become part of the landscape of where you are too, right? Yeah.
Thank you all for entertaining that. I'm happy to open up to questions from the audience. We've got a microphone coming up.
Thank you all for your incredibly heartfelt presentations. And today is International Working Women's Day around the world. And and I have a dream of having an international Indigenous women's art exhibit with examples of our common struggles from around the world. I brought a banner I made because it deals with intergenerational trauma, which is a focus of all our Indigenous nations. And so I'm hoping that some curator here or some museum person will think about having this Indigenous international exhibit with parts from all around the world, because sometimes a lot of us from different marginalized parts of the world are left out and we're unheard. And so you have to do outreach to make sure you're including everybody. Thank you.
Other questions? Don't be afraid. Yeah, don't be shy.
You might have questions for each other.
Thank you again for all of your presentations. My question is in regards to recent trends that museums have been putting objects on long-term loan to Indigenous communities, which removes the need to visit the actual museum. And I'm wondering, in your experiences, the complications of that issue, whereas the museum obviously retains ownership, but it is no longer in those very restrictive boundaries of a collection storage site or a conservation room.
So we have the Arctic Studies Center, the Smithsonian Arctic Studies Center at the Anchorage Museum in Anchorage, and that exhibition's been there for 15 years. It was only supposed to be there for 10 years. They're on long-term loan, and it has been super beneficial to our people. Access, their program is like forward-thinking. It's funny how many conferences I've been to where other people are presenting it as a model. You know, it's amazing. They brought all the elders to select those objects from each culture group of Alaska. That's huge. They just helped facilitate that exhibition. That exhibition was Native selected. And we have students, you saw the picture I had. I mean, it's just been amazing. And repatriation, that is a huge thing. It's a quagmire to try to even get those objects back. A lot of our communities don't have the facilities for them to be able to house them, although we all know that a lot of those objects should be where they were intended originally to go, you know, different types of ceremony and things like that. So it's been a good thing, in my opinion, in Alaska.
Yeah.
Oh, good.
Thank you all. You're all so awesome. Jason, I want to spend more time with you. I just want to say that. I like how your mind works. Well, I hope she'll be part of the conversation. And hopefully we'll have lots of food and other people there too. You made a comment that has connected with a thought that I have had for a while, and that is that when you see Gerhard Richter's work, that you don't see Germany identified in the label. And I actually think that that's part of the problem, is that there's this normalization of anything that's European-based without some recognition of the cultures or the places where those artists have come from and where that work comes from. And I wonder, I don't know what your answer would be, and maybe other people might want to jump in here too to think about this, or maybe there's no interesting response to it. But I wonder if this is one of those ways that we can disrupt that sort of normalization of the European heteronormative perspective that we all struggle against, is to ask them to reclaim their own culture and to reclaim their own geographic homelands in the way that the curators and museums think about all of that art.
That's an interesting question. Thanks for asking it. One of the things I think what I had mentioned is that you don't see a geographic location of what German art should look like when you go to Gerhard Richter's exhibition. But this actually feels like it's in opposition to what you had said earlier, where you don't read the labels when you go to museums because you don't find them useful. So now I'm seeing a disconnect between, it should say Germany and where Richter's from, but then again, you know. It's read information, it's codified information, as it was explained earlier. And I went to a panel recently that explained, Jolene Ricard again, actually talked about maps, right? There has to be a better way. There's a lot of concern and worry, and I'm not going to take up too much time, about leveling things and things becoming too flat, where everything occupies the same kind of space. And that is a real danger, but it's also a very privileged kind of awareness. I do think labels are very important, and I do think scholarship is important, especially as an artist. I want to know what something's made out of, and I want to be able to unconstruct it and unpack it. This was more about trying to mention that there seems to be a disparity of parity between presenting Native artists and non-Native artists. And one of the things is that you may go to an exhibition where Native artists presented alongside Western European male artists. And everyone will have, the name, the medium. But with the Native artists, there'll be their tribal affiliation in parentheses, even when that artist is not specifically talking about their community, which is odd to me.
Other questions?
Just gonna flag your, real quickly, I just noticed.
Good.
Dang, you're the only one who didn't put an ethnic identifier in front there. All right, hon. You put Texas, yeah. No, you put Brooklyn. No, I'm just gonna flag that real interesting. I actually wanted to bring it back though to, I don't know, I don't like the label conversation, so I'm gonna ask a different question of Teri if I can actually. Well, I think, because all you guys are all artists, right? You all work in museums, right? Because I'm not sure, the art world, the requirement, with music. You were captured by a museum, no. No, okay, you work with a museum. Okay, so Teri, no. When you were talking about your work, all the work you were talking about was made for family members. And in fact, they said you were resisting the idea that your artwork would ever enter like a museum space. You said, I'm going to cite this till the day I die, but burn me in my dress has got to be the most revolutionary phrase I've heard in years. But this is a resistance to a kind of the museum in a way that wants to grab onto something that's yours. So how do you find, how do you think about your work being in museums versus your work in a museum, and what are your different roles you think between those two?
Well, I was just telling you at lunch. My experience it's a story. Everything's a story with me. My experience came out of the very first pair of Kiowa men's moccasins that I ever made. And I made them, I looked at them, I researched them, I thought about them, I thought about how they were supposed to be. I made them for the market. I made them for sale. And I sold them to a big collector here in New York City that I'm very grateful to have for my work. Now, I do all kinds of stuff, not just like traditional objects, but at that time I was making traditional objects. I was making moccasins for sale. And I had made those moccasins. He bought them, paid me good money for them. A few years later, he invites me to his fancy house up in Pound Ridge, right? So we're talking big money place. And he has a huge collection, mostly contemporary art. He allowed us to walk through his home by ourselves. My sister was with me there too. And we were looking, and he had this whole row of stuff set out, all beautiful things set out, and my moccasins were right there. So I ran over to them, and they were kind of messed up. So I went to go fix them, and he wasn't around, so I figured it was okay if I touched them. So I went to go fix them, and as soon as I touched them, they were stiff. The buckskin had gotten hard, and I was sad almost immediately because I realized what I had done. I had made those moccasins that I had put that much thought and intent into were never going to be danced in. They were never going to be properly used. And it was at that moment that I made a conscious choice to no longer sell my cultural objects that I was making. If people ask me to do them, I'll definitely do them, Indian way I could trade. But I'm not going to make these things for the market anymore. That I can use the technical skills that I have, the voice that I have, all this art history stuff that y'all are always talking about. I can use that language, and I can figure out a way to put that out in a public space that I'm not feeling like I'm selling out. That I'm not handing over these things that were not meant to be handed over. The image of my mother's footprint in the bottom of her moccasins will stay with me for the rest of my life. And that was what I guess I was missing on those moccasins. I was like, they'll never be properly used. I will never do this again. And I haven't. So I think that answers it.
Yeah.
I wanted to respond to, is this working? Hello, there you go, because I have to go really close. So the cultural affiliation thing is so important to me, and I just wanted to tell this little story about, I was in Copenhagen doing an artist residency, and in a taxi or Uber or something, and the driver says, "Oh, where are you from?" And I said, "I'm from Alaska," and he's like, "Well, isn't Alaska part of the United States? Why didn't you say the United States?" And I said, "Well, because my people are Iñupiat and Athabascan, and we've been there for millennia. I'm not from the United States. My people have been here forever." So, yeah.
So, just really quickly, so in terms of identification, I told the anecdote with the Met staffer, and the reason I told that anecdote is to highlight how right up until the point I was identified as a Native, completely great working relationship. Then once that came in, suddenly everything changed and continues to be kind of weird because of that reason. And those are the kind of pitfalls and expectations and social realist expectations that I think people expect. And my one beautiful patient wife, and I'll refer to her again, gets to hear me go on at home ranting about how I'm often worried that as the Native community runs the risk of being permanently defined by what we're against, seeing as problematic, for really good reasons. There are reasons that we have with institutions, really good reasons, and reasons that institutions need to worry about Natives and Native representation and Native self-representation. But things do change, and there's a radical difference between interacting with the museum as a non-Native and interacting with the museum as an identified Native.
Okay, let's do this.
Crystal, when you're done with that question, we've got someone in the back who's been waiting patiently.
It's true. All right.
No, go ahead. No, you get precedent.
Oh, thank you. Maybe I just want to, this is an important thing about survival, our survival as general?
If you're looking at me, that's why.
Okay, we can talk to you if you want.
No, it's fine.
Okay, no. Jason, listen.
Crystal just turned into the boss of the panel, I think.
Oh, okay, you can have the roll back if you want. But it is a real issue, the idea that when we're in these institutions, we are vulnerable. That being outed as Native, as you said, turns into a real actual problem. Being in the museum is a dangerous place. So I understand the requirement to kind of ghost it a little bit, to become not Native or to become Native after being an individual or an artist. I would say that I think that I would put my cultural identifier down first just because of that issue. Maybe it's an expression of my unique kind of position of privilege, being that I can go into an institution and say, my collaborator will say, "I'm from Little Traverse Band of Ottawa, I'm an elder, I'm a maker, I'm an expert in this kind of weaving," and she will get closed down. And that I'll go in and instead of saying I'm Anishinaabe of Wiikwemikoong, I will say I'm from Columbia University, and I will get in. I hate that, and I'm going to put Anishinaabe of Wiikwemikoong before Columbia University everywhere I can, because I can, right? I do think that's politically important, but we can go back to the question now.
Okay. Is that all right? Here, I'll just stand. It'll be easier to see you all. Thank you all for your presentations. My question was for Crystal, and it actually leads on from what you were saying. Is this okay?
Yes.
Okay. I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about the range of experiences you had going into the museums, and especially with conservators. It really interested me that you said that some were very resistant to you touching the objects. In some cases, you were allowed to. And I wondered if you saw any patterns there, like if there are certain institutions that seem to be having a more open conversation about this, more able to deal with your requests or not. I really just wanted to invite you to say more about that because it sounded fascinating.
Who's that back there?
This is Meredith.
Oh, hi, Meredith. Hi. Okay, thank you for the question. I think this is something any one of us could answer.
I'm glad to hear from anyone.
Absolutely. Maybe there's a whole range of experiences going into institutions, but I find that there tend to be a certain set of politics that will result in a bad experience, and some of it has to do with the ways that the curatorial relation is set up to the conservator, and what the conservator is supposed to be responsible for versus what the curator is responsible for. So perhaps one of the more soured relationships that I came across was when the conservator is trying to assert their authority over the collection in such a way that the conservator is trying to keep control of their collection, and the curator comes in, and the way that the curator is kind of responsible for the outward-facing part of the museum. It's their reputation at stake if they are not accepting of these Native scholars, right? So they are the ones whose job it is to kind of intervene in the institution on behalf of Native people when they come into the institution, and they're supposed to be the ones who say, okay, you have to let these Native people in now, you have to let them do this XYZ that is counter to what you as a conservator is supposed to do. When they're in that position, when the intervention comes at the level of the curator at the top of the hierarchy saying, okay, technicians move aside, there's decolonizing work being done. That's when I find that there is a soured relationship in the room. And the conservator, I'm remembering one particular instance when we brought some elders down to look at their quill work boxes in the museum. Everyone in the room had a long experience dealing with Native scholars and opening and making access. So much had gone into making this work. And the elders came in and saw those pieces on the table and went over and went, oh! They went to go pick them up and talk to them, and there was a conservator in the room who went, wait! Or just put on gloves! Just this moment of panic, this moment of the assertion of authority. And what I think it is I think it comes from a place of internal institutional friction, right? So if you're going to decolonize your museum, if you're going to make it ready, if you're going to make it ready for Native people to not experience violence in that space, you need to be able to prepare everyone who is going to be in contact with those people in what's going on. It can't just be the occasional curatorial, directive from above that says, okay, now we have to make this special space, this special opening.
So in my preparation for the exhibition at MIA, I went to over 20 different institutions, everywhere from NMNH, which are, natural history museums, to fine arts museums. And my experience was really varied, just like you're saying. It's so varied, and each institution has its own personality when it comes to their collections. And what I can say, as a fact, as a Native person, the institutions that had Indians that were keepers of their collections, or at least were involved in some way in keeping those collections, were much more welcoming spaces. The ones that had no Native staff on, man, they have no protocols. They're just grad kids doing what they're doing, making their bones, right? And it was shocking because I was going to so many museums in such a short period of time. It was really actually kind of discombobulating. I was like, whoa, they get it. Whoa, they totally don't get it. And it's high and low. I mean, there's no protocol across the United States. Every museum is different. And I would say there's some major museums that need a lot of work. And I tell you where you can start. Hire Indians. Hire Natives.
Get some Indians paid.
Put some Native people on staff.
Get some Native babies fed.
Yeah.
When you are not decolonizing.
Yeah, not just one, not a tokenistic, thing towards diversity. Actual, real engagement.
But I think the rest of that needs to be, don't just hire any Indian.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Right. I mean, let's have expertise pull its role into here.
Absolutely. Yes. Yes. Qualified. Yes.
Yep. Yeah.
Thank you.
Working at a museum with a really wide-ranging collection from prehistoric to contemporary Native American work, I have a question about what you see ideally in terms of organizing a permanent collection gallery, like in terms of strategies. I mean, that traditional culture map, many galleries are organized, for example, along culture lines, but I think there's a tendency now to maybe try to broaden that and get away from that. So I just wanted your perspectives on that subject.
I had a professor a long time ago say something to me that stuck in my head, and I don't know if this applies or not, but it occurred to me when you said that. You know, the more Native you are, the less Native you are. I'm not Native American, I'm Kiowa. And there's a specificity to that. I was born a Kiowa, I will die a Kiowa. And I can't see through any other lens. I mean, I'm open to understanding other ways, but I know what I know, what I know. And that is what was given to me, and it comes long line, and I'm passing it forward, you know? So I don't know if that helps any, but like, you know, culture areas, we're also specific. We've been here for thousands of years, and we have very distinct personalities. And there's a recognition of that. There should be a recognition of that.
I agree.
Yep. Or maybe I can add, maybe like, I do see this this reach from the art museum installing these kind of cultural galleries, and to follow the example of the anthropological gallery. Sorry, can you hear me? To follow the example of the anthropological museums in dealing with these cultural areas, right? And there's this idea of the comprehensive, the totality, to be able to encompass all that might be considered indigenous. So indigeneity as a concept, I think, needs to be complicated up front, even though I keep saying indigenous museum. Specificity, I think I'm gonna have to agree with Teri. You have to tell a few specific stories and kind of seed the idea that you're going to offer an idea of indigenous totality in this space, that you're going to be able to even account for anything. So specific stories, and not the map, okay? As though it's showing the boundaries, the outer reaches of everything. There has to be a way that you signal this is not this, like the backing off of authority, and get this idea of the comprehensive totality. Yeah.
We have 5 more minutes left of the Q&A. If we have just 1 or 2 more questions.
Hello, and thank you so much for your words and for your work. I'm Kiani Naizinatsanachini and Sotanaa. I'm a member of the Diné Nation, the Navajo Nation. Thank you all for being here, and thank you to the Italian Academy for putting this on. Throughout today, both this morning and this afternoon, we've heard a lot about non-natives' efforts to preserve and codify a pretty fetishistic and imaginary understanding of indigenous identities. And we've heard that also this afternoon with the idea of the war bonnet being, you know, the idiosyncratic idea of indigenous art or aesthetics, as well as the idiosyncratic idea of particular moccasins. And what we continue to hear is that there's this fetish that brings a lot of non-natives to the table. And there's a comment this afternoon about the fact that that identity-based art loses its luster once the fetish dissolves, something to that effect. And I'm curious, is there a way that we can harness the fetish, that which is not us, that which is an imaginary past, and mobilize that to have non-natives gain a better understanding of who we are, and, you know, for lack of a better phrase, you know, come for the fetish, stay for the reality of our lives. So, yeah.
Yeah, actually, you're starting to see it happen more and more as museums began to want to develop ongoing relationships with indigenous communities in their area as part of the constituency. At a certain time, there would be one exhibition in November every couple of years, and now you're beginning to see an ongoing commitment to listening to communities and engaging them. So I think there's a lot of work is being made, and I kind of want to say I owe a lot of it. I think a lot of it probably comes from Standing Rock. That got a lot of press, that generated a lot of energy. a lot of attention around Indigenous rights and the fact that some of the things that the people there were fighting for were universal items, that things that people could rally around. Clean water. Where's the argument against clean water? But I think that's mostly what it is ongoing commitments is something that's very important. But it's also very dangerous because there has to be a certain level of self-representation in this ongoing commitment. It can't just be the institution dictating the terms of engagement, which is what these guys are all about.
There should be a recognition. We are Americans, are we not? We, as Native people, have contributed to the identity of America in deep, in lasting ways, in government, in society, in our soul of our identity as Americans. And that, it should start there. We belong in the conversation. We have been held outside of the conversation or as tokens or whatever it is around the edges, but we belong in the conversation because this place does not exist without us. You as American citizens do not exist without us. And so I would say just fold us in. We are part of this. We helped you become.
I don't know if there's a great way to follow that up. That just might be our our time to thank our panelists deeply for the work that they shared with us today, and to open things up to a more general discussion. So please join me in thanking everyone.
So the idea was to now invite the panelists from the first panel to join the panelists from the second panel and have a hootenanny, free-for-all. We'll see how that works. Because we didn't have as much time for Q&A this morning. We wanted to make sure there was more chance perhaps for people to go back to something they didn't have a chance to ask. But also, it's possible that some of the people from this morning's panel also have some things to say about some of the questions that just came up. So I want to also give them a chance if they want to weigh in. So just give us a second to orient ourselves. So I guess first I just wanted to make sure, does anybody who just came up want to say anything, ask any questions or say anything in response to the questions that were already asked? Do you want to add, Sherry?
The lady who was talking about exhibiting the collection that they have, I think one of the things I'd like to see museums moving away from is this idea of having these sort of mega permanent, this idea that you do it once and that you have to tell this, unmanageable story once. And I think engaging with collections in multiple ways, looking for, ideas that can be traced broadly through the collection and bringing that out forward. And sometimes also we use, when we curate, we often use objects as words in a story that we're writing. I forget who mentioned curatorial ego. Was that you, Heather? Yeah. So that rather than unpacking the stories that some of these objects have, because they have remarkable stories of science and technology, genius, and instead of just having an object stand in and here's the story and this object is telling the story. Because I think we can do better. And I think that that's something that Indigenous curators also have to think about, because so often how we learn about curation and what we see is what we have these ideas as well, that we think we have these trajectories that we have to talk about. I think we need to play, and we need to rethink, and we need to think that we can do it maybe on a smaller scale, but more innovatively.
Yeah, I'd like to speak partly to what Teri was talking about including Native America in this larger conversation, because it's been kind of a hobby horse of mine that when I recognized this when I was in Chicago at the Newberry and I was asked to advise on the Illinois state standards in history. And I said, well, how many questions do you have on Native America? And they said, one. And it's about the Trail of Tears. And I said, what is the state grade at which they cease learning about Native America? 4th grade. That is the national average, 4th grade. Think of what you learn in 4th grade. You learn nice things. You don't learn about genocide, language dispossession, and so on. You go away with Pocahontas and Sacagawea and Squanto as the accommodating Indians of American history. And then we are off the stage completely. All right, that's a thing for education, but what does this have to do with museums? That means all the heavy lifting must be done by museums, all of it. Where are you going to learn about anything as an adult? God forbid the internet. And so TV, movies, Dances with Wolves, you are probably going to learn it at a museum, which you trust to be arbiters of this knowledge. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. They're better when we're part of it, but it's a huge burden that museums carry because they have, and when people, we were talking about labels earlier, and there's not a label long enough to explain everything you don't know about Native America, right? People go in and say, I didn't understand some of this stuff. Well, then get reading, son, because there's a lot of stuff written about us. We're out there to talk about it too. But 4th grade, just keep that in your mind, that if that's when you're done with something, you're not learning very much. And museums, we're trying to help with cultural centers, museums, and so on, do our bit, but we can't do it all.
I have to say, part of the reason why we're in the situation we're in right now is literally because we don't know these things, because our fellow Americans do not understand their own history. We do not know where we come from as Americans, as a nation. And it's absurd to me. It was absurd to me when I was in high school and I got that one paragraph about Native Americans that I reread like 20 times because I couldn't believe that tome this big only had one paragraph in it. I mean, this is our experience. Most of you people are of my generation. We know what we were taught in public schools.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences with us. I wanted to ask a question that followed on this discussion that we had just started now. I think it would be so very much helpful to really understand the diversity of the indigenous peoples in North America, also the diversity of the language and the cultures. So I think one of the problems is that we haven't learned where the nations are, what their histories are, what their cultures are. So it seems that as Indigenous people, of course, you have much more knowledge about that. And since we haven't learned about that in public schools or in our education in mainstream American society, I was curious as to where each of you learned about that beautiful diversity of Indigenous nations other than just your own.
By living. And I wish I was being sarcastic. I'm really not. I mean, the truth is I was raised in Oklahoma, and every church gathering, every community gathering, perhaps we're unique there because we have so many different tribes, but we're raised with these stories. And I think that that's part of what makes it so difficult, is because these stories rest within our communities, but in the larger sort of educational experience, we are completely erased after 4th grade, apparently. And
sorry, I was just gonna say, I grew up very much surrounded by Haudenosaunee everything, and so classic, what we call Eurocentrism, right? And I remember being in college and asking a Navajo friend of mine, this was in New Hampshire at Dartmouth, and I said, "Oh, you're far from home. How do you like Dartmouth?" And he said, "The school's okay, but I hate New Hampshire." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "There's too many trees." He said, I just hate that everything's green. Everywhere I look is green. Bushes are green, grass is green, trees are green. And he said, you can't see the landscape. It's obscured by trees. And I was just blown away by this notion that my beloved woodlands region was not universally appreciated, and that there was a whole other way to look at the earth. And it started there. I just started, I'm going to go out to America and travel all over when I can, and meet people and read about them. But it started then, kind of, because it was like a thunderclap. I just didn't realize that I knew these people were in different parts, but I didn't think about it.
So he's right. Upstate is horrifying. Can't take it. But yeah, mostly I grew up in a very homogenous, town. Marfa wasn't very big. You're either white or you look like me. And then I went to college in Indian Territory in Texas and in Colorado at the foot of the Rocky Mountains. And actually that's where I learned a lot of diversity in school with the Native clubs and being involved with those groups. And then as we graduated and moved on to other areas, we kept in contact and we would visit each other.
I'd like to add though, but you asked the question is where can you learn about it? And where did I learn about it? What I can tell you is that I think what Jason said and what Scott just said is really important to say, and that is that we went out looking for the other people. I mean, I have worked in museums and with art for a long time, and it wasn't until just this last fall that I went to Europe. And I had been challenged by other museum professionals. Oh, you haven't really seen the great museums. You haven't really studied the cultures. Well, I can tell you that I've been in almost every state on this continent, in this country, and I've been to a lot of ceremonies, and I have heard these languages. You guys have just as much access to go, and you have just as much access. Teri's getting me fired up. It's all Teri's fault. You can find these places. They're not hidden to you. You're just not looking.
Oh, that's good. The language is all around you over here on the East Coast. It is all around you. Just start paying attention.
I just wanted to say something about the trees and stuff, because when I went from Nome to Fairbanks, I was like, how do you hunt here? You can't see anything.
I was really shocked when I took my daughter back to Quebec and she kept complaining about the trees. And I thought, oh my God, I've raised a prairie kid. How did that happen, right? But last week, my daughter posted something that had turned up as a Facebook memory. Those float up. And what she had written 7 years ago when she was in law school was a Soto in a Cree world. And then her comment was, whoa, must have been feeling disenfranchised. But a lot of times how we learn about others is, even within our regions there might be diversity, and sometimes there's tensions between those different folks. So I grew up hearing Soto, hearing Michif, and hearing also a blended language, which is sometimes called Bungi, which is a mixture of Gaelic and Soto, which is from the Scottish Métis. And so there was that and French, so it's like that linguistic diversity was just something that I grew up with. And then also because my family was from Quebec, since I was 2 years old, I was driving, back and forth. And so it's just, through our lives, I suppose. But also, I remember being up north and there was a powwow dancer. I know you talk about the generic feather headdress and stuff, as representation. And there was, this is on a stage in a northern community, and this kid goes, "Look at the Indian." And the dancer looks down and says, "Never mind, you're an Indian." And this kid goes, "I'm not an Indian, I'm Cree." Because his perception, even as this child growing up, with fluent in his language, immersed in his culture, has internalized this stereotype of what an Indian is, and yet he has got nothing to do with him, right?
That's awesome. Okay, I'll put. I guess it comes as no surprise to me that the Indians are very cosmopolitan in relation to other Indians. I don't know. I think I find it very hard. Well, actually, I come from a very, very Anishinaabe-centric area, and we claim everyone. These guys are Anishinaabe. You're Anishinaabe. You married Anishinaabe. You're not away. but you can come up. But we're still, it's especially our family relations. Someone's married to someone else within across a nation. These are international boundaries. Like, we all identify, I find, very much as Native people, but we are so cosmopolitan, right? So this is something, because our world extends very broadly geographically, even though it's all still very indigenous. Maybe our world is a little smaller, but it's always been the case that that indigenous people have had a broader awareness, I think, of themselves as small nations in a larger world, in a way that, I don't know, larger American society often seems to find or to feel itself to be, or the majority is a little more ever present, I guess, for non-natives.
This isn't really necessarily related, but I remember in grad school, there was this guy from Long Island, and he's like, "You're so lucky, you have so much to draw upon." And then I went to his house, my husband and I visited his house, and I was like, holy shit, you have so much Irish and Italian. And after meeting his family, I'm like, you're just not looking. And I always say that everybody was indigenous at one point. All of us were. We were people of the land. And I think that's where we all messed up. It's like, we're not people of the land anymore. We're not people, you know, of the sky and the water. You know, we've lost those connections. So, yeah, anyhow.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I'm Faith Russell Navajo from Round Rock, Arizona. And I want to just thank everyone here for their words. It's been very provocative. I'm really absorbing a lot and a bit overwhelmed, but the one thing that keeps coming back to me is looking at museums as a way of education. And even though we may say that's a lot of education to do, my response is, why are you existing then, if not to educate the public? And so my question comes from, what is it, I mean, who do you see when you look at museums, the person walking through the door? And that person walking through the door, if you've had some contact with them in some way to educate them, what is it, each of you, one or two things that you think are the most important things that they should come away with about American Indians? Because I think each of you has this incredible responsibility and weight on your shoulders. And you may not think that, but from just a person who's never taken an art history course, it's like I look up to each of you because you've come into this world, into this profession, and this art. And I'm really counting on you to be the people that are the liaison, the ones where the nexus happens between the museum and the people coming through. And then we've talked a bit about culture, but it lingers with me about how do you see this perpetuating who we are as Native people? And not Native, you know, in a general sense, but tribally. But first, you know, who is that person walking through the door, and what is it that you really think is so essential that they should know that you're sitting there engaging in your life's work? Because I think that's what I'm counting on from each of you.
I've actually been tasked with curating the 150th anniversary of Manitoba as a province being formed, of curating that exhibition for the Winnipeg Art Gallery. And I've had to ask myself that very question. Because, I mean, I don't know how many of you know Canadian history, but in Canadian history books, sometimes it's called the Riel Rebellion. It wasn't, but And so it's like with that specificity, but who is the audience? And I was going to do this really, and when I was in grad school, I was tasked with coming up with this imaginary exhibition, and I was going to just hit that Plains Gallery, and it was just going to be all about all this crappy stuff that happened. And I was waiting to be buzzed upstairs to go work in, you know, where the stuff was. And as I'm sitting there, these busloads of children from inner city, from northern communities. Like there must have been 5 busloads of kids. They're all in grade 3. And they were a very multicultural bunch. And you could see like the Nish kids playing with the Filipino kids. And all of a sudden I thought, oh my, that's my audience. So how do I tell a tough story in a way that will respect those little friendships, that won't single out the individual Indigenous kids, whether they're Cree or Métis or Saulteaux or Dakota, so that they feel alienated from their classmates. So that I think of those little kids and I want them to walk out feeling proud. So how do I do that? And then how do I do it also? I think we have a tendency, maybe in museums we need to be more careful, art galleries, maybe not so much, but when we have an audience of the general public, when we have an audience of families, when we have an audience of children, we have to come from a place of compassion for all the people that walk in. I think we have this tendency to want to hit people over the head with our history. And sometimes we fall in love with our victimhood and our traumas, and we don't own it. I mean, globally, everyone has stories of this. And we've got a particular one, but we also need to focus on telling those stories of resilience and our genius, and just these amazing people who straddled these incredibly difficult times so amazingly. So what I've titled, my working title, and this is the title we're going to go with, is we're using it's called A Hard Birth. And so within the title, we want the essence that the creation of this province was a hard birth. I've got enough space, I hope, to tell a story, but we're planning right off the hop to work with teachers so that we can, because I know teachers will be looking to institutions like the museum, like the art gallery, to provide the resources so that they can do a decent job of teaching this history, because it's not out there. It's not easily accessible, like for the lady who answered the question. We have to acknowledge it. It's not easy to get this information. It's just not that commonly accessible, although it should be. But it's like, I think we have to come from a place of compassion, and we have to think about, you know, wanting to build pride and understanding. And that sounds very like apple pie, but it's not impossible.
So listening to you speak, it makes me think I've been in New York too long. You know? So my own personal anecdotes is, one is when I walk through the education area, I thank God I'm not in education, because it is a zoo. I was like, no way. Get me to my little office. The other thing is one of the perks of my job is I get to go museum-wide. Every department, all parts of the building, bigger than the Louvre. And I'll often see someone, and I have my favorite galleries, and I'll go there and I'll check in on stuff. And since late last year, I go through the American wing now, and I used to never go through there. It's made with 1990s Chinese steel. It's going to collapse any second now. But so you'll see people, and you'll see people with cameras holding it up, and I'm thinking, cool, they're taking a picture of this relic. They're taking selfies, man. It's nothing but selfies. And I'm so disappointed when I walk by. And so to answer your question, it's a lot of work, but I'm not necessarily sure it's there's been some crosstalk, and perhaps I'm going to gently disagree with some of my fellow panelists, where I don't think it's the museum's job to educate. It's up to the particular person to want to know. They either want to understand this stuff, or they want to, play whatever latest iPod games out, that kind of thing. There are a lot of distractions, and there are a lot of things pulling people away from being smart. That's the nature of politics now. And I think eventually some people may grow out of it and want to learn more, and they'll become a better person for it, and kudos to them if they do, and I hope they do.
I probably agree with Jason on certain aspects, that just because I think a burden has been put on the museum, I don't think it should be put on the museum. I think the burden should be put on education and school, and a demand that serious reform be made. But I also am often frustrated with educational projects I see at museums. I remember taking my niece when she was just 7 to a museum, and we were looking at art. And this woman docent came up and said, "Do you want this guide that makes a game like, you know, can you see the man's hat in this picture?" And she said, "No, I just want to look at the art." And I thought, that's my girl. You know, because she just could see, like, why are you doing that? You know, I came to look at these paintings, and you're trying to make it into some weird game or something. And I get all the well-meaningness, like the road to perdition, but I don't think that's what I'm looking for. I'm just saying that to answer your original question, what I would want that person to learn, I would like them to learn the specificity of our cultures, the diversity of them, and so that they're not a big homogenous, where's the guy in the headdress? And I would also like them to recognize that these are living cultures now, and I would like there to be maybe, I don't know, if we're going to fight about maps, how about a map of the reservation nearest you in many cases? And how about some photographs of young Indian people doing things, you know, that they do, whether it be a sports game or a powwow or whatever. But I want them to start with that and then work back to the artifact and not have as an addendum at the end, oh, and a few of them are still around. Because that's how I feel a lot of these feel to me now. But so that's what I would want. That yes, we are still here, foremost in the front, and we still have our national identities.
I would just add, because I was coming to those same points, so thank you for saying those, is that one of the experiences I've had in working in institutions that for me as a curator has been most fulfilling is when, and you know, not all the museums I've worked at have been Native museums, is when those Indian kids come in the gallery and they see themselves.
I just want to clarify what I'm going to do with the education is I'm probably going to do not much with the education department of the actual gallery. Because I'm talking Winnipeg, where there's a lot of Native people, and there's a network that I'm aware of because I, you know, spent a lot of time in Manitoba, and there's a really powerful organization of Native teachers. And so that's who I'm talking to. And whether the gallery will get on board or not, because I'm like, are you going to put it on your website? If not, we'll just make our own. And we'll maybe hook up with maybe one of the artist-run centers or one of the teaching organizations and start with that expertise. So it's like building on that community resource. And, you know, we'll see how it goes with the internal stuff in the gallery. But there has been this real tendency with educational program. It doesn't matter how wonderful an exhibition you curate. The shop and the children's programming can reduce the most brilliantly curated exhibition to, you know, beaded keychains and paper feather headdresses. And like I've walked into like the ROM, oh my God. I was teaching museum curation and I was in Toronto to look at a show, and I just ended up spending all this time in the shop and did a whole lecture on how the store undermined everything that the curators were trying to do. Oh God, yeah.
I'm gonna add my museum anecdote, but I got my start, I guess, in my tribal museum, just working as the curatorial assistant at the Ojibwe Cultural Foundation, and I think I've found that the adversarial relationship between Native people and museums was just so entrenched that you actually have to make the museum not a museum before you can even have a really relationship. So within the community, this tribal museum, which was then called a museum, and it was like on the reservation, staffed entirely by Native people. And so I made a little show one time, and I went down and to my aunt and uncle's house for lunch, and I was like, oh, are you guys gonna come to the opening later at the museum? And they're like, no. Like, oh, do you guys ever go down to the museum? And they're like, no, that's where the white people come to see what we're about, you know? That's the white people containment center. It was like the more I started to work there, the more it's the place where every single German that came down there asking for the Indian village, we're like, well, it's here, yes. After I left, we kind of reimagined what the institution was there, so it's not a museum anymore, it's a cultural foundation, and rather than charging admission and having exhibitions that were like trying to be about, okay, this is what Anishinaabe people are, this is what this place is, we would have, it's like an artist studio now, so all the community members who are artists can come and use the space and the like free equipment, and we can actually close the door if there's a tool coming through and they don't want people gawking at them, right? So we had to become not a museum before community members started coming in. But then it started happening. People started coming, seeing my exhibits, Once we weren't a museum, everyone came and said, Crystal, that was a great little show you did on, baskets. Not sure what the moral is there.
So I'm in the middle of curating this exhibition, and I don't want to say too much because God only knows. But it's interesting that you talked about the store, because I'm the daughter of a trader, and I'm acutely aware of how our material culture is sold to a non-native audience as curio. I grew up on the route to Yellowstone National Park, and my sister and I were photographed for money by tourists because we were real Indians, right? And I would gladly take the money, please. We're just out in front playing in the dirt. But one of the things in curating this exhibition, there was a whole bunch of things to it. For one, when I was asked to curate, I was asked to co-curate, I said yes, and then I realized absolutely not. There is no way I can speak for any of you people. I have no rights to speak for you all. And as the Native person, I was not going to be the token check mark for the NEA grant or the NEH grant. I just wasn't going to do it. And so we ended up calling in a large group of women to help us understand what we were going to say, why we were going to say it, and to help us choose what to say. And my co-curator has taken a lot of heat for that because she was told that she was given up curatorial control. Now, in my end in mind, we don't do anything without consensus. So it was a group of women coming together, coming to some sort of consensus about what we were doing and why we were doing it. In my mind, that process was working. In the institutional mind, we were not working. She had given up her place of power and authority, and who am I? I'm just some Indian artist anyway. I was just the check mark, right, in terms of the institution. So huge learning process on my part, because I've always been on the other side of it. You curators come to me. I'm like, oh yes, please show this thing in your fancy museum. I've never been on the other side of what that means and the pressures that are put on curation and the story that's told and how it's told. The very process of telling that story was undermined for us. And then just like that, the shop. I made dang sure that, because they all walk through the shop on the way out of these big exhibitions. I did not want the same stuff that's at all the trade shows here in New York City ending up in that shop, because we know our collectives. We know these ladies and men and women are dying to make a little bit of scratch on a museum shop. And I'll say this. The museum staff were ever grateful that I came with a bunch of names of artists and native-run things that you could easily, these are things that manufactured to go in your shop. I was receptive to, and I thought that's the little curio that they're going to walk out with. They're going to walk out with something that comes from a native community, so much more meaningful than stickers printed on Taiwan or wherever. So I don't know what the question was, but I just wanted to put that out there, that this whole the process of curation itself is difficult when you're a community-minded person, or you're a person that understands that you're not capable or shouldn't be speaking for others.
I'm going to add a comment in here. I love listening to Teri. Actually, I love all these voices, so I'm really happy. But she brings up a point, and I think it's one that it's very difficult from this side of the table, this side of the conversation, and this side of the community to convey to people who are somewhere else how difficult it is to be a Native person in a museum, whether it's as an artist, whether it's as a community member, whether it's as a Native scholar, whether it's as a curator. I would add that not only are we there representing ourselves, and often only just trying to do that, right? We're just trying to be ourselves and be the best human being that we can be in that moment and in that day. But in the scope of that, it's like this morning. I can't go anywhere, and I don't have relatives that don't show up in the audience. My cousin is here today, and I didn't know she was going to be here. But this has happened. I can't tell you how many times this has happened, where I've been someplace speaking, and I have seen a representative from my tribal community like walk in the back door. I don't get to be unaccountable beyond myself. I don't get to be just me in that space. And holding that space and creating room, because I don't want to be alone there. That to me is like, as piddly and simple-minded as I am, that is to me the biggest thing I can contribute to this conversation, is creating room for other people to be at the table, creating room for other people to come in those collections, creating potential pathways. We were having a conversation last night. I'm at a museum, we're building our collection management policy. What do we need to do to make sure that we invite the community and the artists into our collection? That we don't set up parameters just because that's what museums have always done. That keep those people that we're trying to engage in the conversation from feeling like they're welcomed. These are really complex questions, and it's the artists who sometimes help us to see the clarity. I mean, Sonya was speaking to this topic last night. I'm like, oh my God, we're like thinking we're done with our collection management policy, but we haven't even addressed that. We've had conversations around it, but we haven't addressed it. And I think that just making room in the conversation, having an opportunity like today where, you know, I've probably sat at the table with a few of these people, but I've never had the opportunity to do this. And I'm really grateful for that. I'm really grateful for today. I'm really grateful for the conversation. And I'm really grateful to have the privilege that I have to be sitting here, to be working at the institution I'm at. And I think that making space for Native voices, whether it's in the gallery so that the kids can see themselves there, whether it's in the scholarship, whether it's in how many Native faculty members are here at Columbia, for God's sake. Native North American art history was born on this campus, and why is there not more presence? As the Native students are coming here, who's here to cultivate them as cultural people, beyond just intellectual beings? But that's not a challenge just to Columbia. It's the whole freaking system. I'm trying not to swear. I know, Wanda did that this morning. I was like, yes. It's a part of the system, and it's a part of the problem with the system. And I don't think that's a problem just for us as Native people. I think it's a problem for everybody who's sitting in here. So you each have a role in making space. You each have a role. I don't know what it is. I don't know any of you people. Well, I know a few people. But
where's your cousin?
My cousin, my best friend. I don't know what your place is. I don't know where your role is. But whatever it is, you have an obligation to make room at your table. And I just ask you to consider, where is that? And what is that table? And how do you open that door?
Break. That's it. No, that's it. That's it. Good.